On a golden afternoon in Manhattan's exclusive Riverside Gardens, magnate Robert Sterling and his wife Margaret were enjoying a romantic stroll through the Millionaire's private paradise. But when Margaret leans over the ornamental bridge to photograph a majestic swan, the ancient balustrade gives way, throwing her into the icy waters of the lake. Desperate and unable to swim, Robert screams for help as he watches his wife drown. It is then that a 12-year-old black boy, barefoot and dressed in rags, scales the golden railings and dives in without hesitation to save Margaret's life. Marcus Collins accomplishes the impossible, bringing her back to the shore, but when Robert tries to reward him with money, the boy refuses. The words Marcus utters next will reveal a devastating truth about the society around them and shatter the millionaire's heart forever, a truth that will change not only their lives but also the way we perceive human compassion.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The golden afternoon sun filtered through the majestic canopies of the century-old oaks, creating a mosaic of light and shadow over the perfectly paved paths of Riverside Gardens. The exclusive park, an oasis of tranquility in the pulsating heart of Manhattan, stretched out like a green emerald carpet, where every leaf seemed to have been carefully placed by skilled hands. Margaret Harrison walked with the natural elegance of someone born for that life, her $1,500 Louboutin heels gently touching the polished asphalt. The Italian silk dress hugged her slender silhouette, while the Mikimoto pearl necklace swayed delicately against her alabaster skin. Her blonde hair, freshly styled from the most exclusive salon on Fifth Avenue, captured the sunlight like strands of gold. "You should have seen Peterson's face when I signed the contract," Robert said, his deep voice echoing a satisfaction that only business success could provide. At 52, he maintained the imposing posture that had made him one of the city's most respected real estate magnates. His $3,000 Armani suit was impeccable, not a wrinkle, not a thread out of place. Margaret laughed, a crystalline sound dancing in the air perfumed by the imported roses adorning the flower beds. "I imagine he didn't expect you to close the Century Plaza deal so quickly," she replied, her blue eyes shining with the genuine pride she felt for her husband. $52 million. Robert shook his head, still impressed with his own feat. "In less than a week. Sometimes I surprise myself with what we've managed to build, Margaret." They walked toward the ornamental lake, passing well-dressed families who whispered discreetly, recognizing the Harrisons. Children played under the watchful eyes of uniformed nannies, while Wall Street executives relaxed on mahogany benches, their phones temporarily silenced in that sanctuary of peace. The aroma of magnolias mingled with Margaret's subtle perfume Chanel and Degree 5, a fragrance she had worn for 20 years, since they got married. Robert took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the perfect life they had built together. Every step in that private paradise was a reminder of how far they had come. "Do you remember when we walked through Central Park in our early years of marriage?" Margaret asked, her fingers intertwining with his. "We thought that was luxury." Robert smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "And now we have our own private garden. $20,000 a year just to have access to this place. It would be worth 10 times more," she murmured, watching the white swans glide gracefully across the mirrored surface of the lake. The soft sound of water running in small artificial cascades created a natural symphony that muffled the distant roar of New York traffic. There, surrounded by that bubble of privilege, it was easy to forget that on the other side of the golden walls existed a bustling city, filled with people who could never afford even an hour in that exclusive paradise. Margaret paused for a moment, admiring a peacock strolling majestically across the manicured lawn. "Sometimes I wonder if we are living in a fairy tale," she said, her voice choked with an emotion that even she couldn't fully define. "If it's a fairy tale, may it never end," Robert replied, lightly kissing her face. They continued walking, approaching the area of the lake where the ornamental bridge rose like a work of art over the crystal-clear waters. The sun began to decline, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold that reflected on the tranquil surface. Some elderly couples fed the goldfish that lazily swam among the water lilies. Margaret took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the pure air that seemed to have been filtered just for them. Her eyes scanned the perfect landscape, every tree, every flower, every detail meticulously planned to create that feeling of being in another world. "Just look at this, Robert," she sighed, extending her arm toward the lake where the last rays of sunlight created golden diamonds on the water. "How beautiful and peaceful everything is here." The gentle afternoon breeze carried the scent of roses when Margaret spotted the most magnificent swan she had ever seen. The graceful bird glided across the mirrored surface of the lake, its snow-white feathers contrasting with the golden reflection of the setting sun. Her blue eyes sparkled with that pure joy that only beauty could awaken in her. "Robert, you need to see this," she whispered, pulling out her iPhone from the side of her Hermes bag. "I've never seen such a perfect swan." The state-of-the-art phone trembled slightly in her hands as she approached the ornamental balustrade of the bridge. The intricately carved wrought iron was a work of art, each curve and leaf masterfully sculpted by the finest European craftsmen. Margaret delicately leaned on the railing, tilting to get the perfect angle. "Be careful, dear," Robert murmured absently, his eyes still lost in the golden reflections of the water as he thought about the day's success. The swan, as if it understood it was the star of the moment, elegantly stretched its neck, creating concentric ripples that captured the sunlight. Margaret let out a soft laugh, that crystal sound that Robert loved so much, and leaned a little further, trying to capture the majesty of the bird in all its glory. "Just a little more," she murmured to herself, her body stretching over the ornamental balustrade. It was then that the old metal, corroded by time and the lake's moisture, gave way. The sound of the iron breaking echoed like a gunshot in the silence of the park. Margaret felt the world spin in slow motion, her eyes widening in pure terror as she realized she was losing her balance. Her desperate hands tried to grab something, anything, but found only air. "Robert!" The scream tore from her throat the moment her body disappeared behind the broken balustrade. The impact with the cold water was brutal. The surface that moments before had seemed a golden mirror transformed into a liquid mass that swallowed her like a hungry mouth. The Italian silk dress, so light and elegant on solid ground, became a deadly weight pulling her down, clinging to her skin like a murderous second skin. Margaret emerged for a second, coughing and gasping, her blonde hair now plastered to her face in dark strands. "Help!" she screamed, before being pulled down again by the weight of the pearl necklace that seemed to have turned into lead around her neck. "Margaret! Margaret!" Robert ran to the edge of the bridge, his face pale as paper, his eyes wide with terror. His hands trembled violently as he clung to the remaining pieces of the balustrade. "Someone help! Someone help my wife!" But the riverside gardens, always so crowded and full of life, suddenly seemed deserted. The few visitors nearby took precious seconds to understand what was happening, and even more to run toward the lake. Margaret was desperately fighting against the water, her hands slapping the surface in increasingly weak movements. The silk dress had become a deadly trap, wrapping around her legs and preventing any coordinated movement. Each attempt to swim was thwarted by the weight of the jewelry she wore with such pride: the diamond earrings, the gold bracelet, the pearl necklace that had now turned into anchors. I can't swim," she gasped, her strength fading quickly. The cold water filled her lungs, burning like liquid fire. Her blue eyes, usually so bright, began to lose focus as panic took over completely. Robert, paralyzed by his own inadequacy, knew he was a terrible swimmer. His few swimming lessons in youth felt like a distant dream as he watched his wife, his whole life, disappearing into the dark waters of the ornamental lake. "I'm going to jump!" he shouted, but his legs did not obey the commands of his desperate brain. The fear of drowning alongside her froze his movements, creating a psychological torture that tore him apart inside. Margaret submerged again, this time staying underwater longer. When she finally managed to surface, her breathing was ragged, desperate. "Robert, please!" Her voice was just an agonizing whisper that could barely cross the distance between them. The waters of the lake, once so calm and inviting, now seemed like an insatiable monster. Every movement of Margaret created waves that pushed her away from the shore, away from salvation, away from the man who loved her but felt completely powerless to save her. "Help! Someone who can swim!" Robert yelled until his voice became hoarse, but his cries seemed to get lost in the golden emptiness of the late afternoon. Margaret made one more desperate attempt to stay afloat, her arms moving in slow motion, her breathing increasingly labored. The face that minutes before radiated happiness was now contorted by pure terror. "Robert! Don't let me die!" Margaret's final scream echoed through the calm waters of the lake, reverberating among the majestic trees and getting lost in the fragrant air of Riverside Gardens, where paradise had turned into a nightmare. On the other side of the golden bars that separated Riverside Gardens from the real world, Marcus Williams pressed his thin face against the wrought iron, peering through the ornamental openings at a universe that seemed straight out of a movie. The 12-year-old boy had a habit of stopping there every afternoon after school, fascinated by that piece of paradise that existed so close yet so far from his reality. His bare feet touched the cold concrete of the sidewalk, his toes slightly blue from the biting October wind. The t-shirt he wore had once been white, but now displayed a collection of stains and small tears that told the story of a childhood lived on the rough streets of the Bronx. The jeans, too big for his skinny frame, were held up at the waist by a piece of rope his mother had improvised. But it was his eyes that drew attention, large, expressive, dark honey-colored, radiating a kindness that no adversity could erase. Marcus watched the wealthy family stroll along the paved paths, imagining what it would be like to walk on that perfect lawn, to breathe that air that seemed purer. "One day," he whispered to himself, "one day I will go in there." Not out of envy or resentment, but from a pure curiosity about what it would be like to live in that different world. Marcus had no malice in his heart even when he saw children his age playing with toys that cost more than his family earned in a month. He simply smiled and imagined how much fun it would be. It was then that the scream cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Help!" Marcus straightened up immediately, his senses sharpened by life on the streets, picking up the genuine despair in that voice. His eyes swept the park until they found the scene unfolding near the ornamental lake. A blonde woman, dressed in expensive clothes, was desperately struggling in the water while a man in a suit shouted from the bridge. "Someone help! Someone help my wife!" Marcus's heart raced. He recognized that sound, the pure panic of someone losing a loved one. It was the same despair he had heard in his mother's voice when his younger brother had an asthma attack and they couldn't afford the medicine. Without thinking twice, Marcus stepped back a few paces from the gate. His small, calloused hands gripped the iron bars, and with the agility that only a child raised on the streets possessed, he began to climb. His bare feet found support on the ornamental decorations, every muscle in his thin body working with iron determination. "Hey, kid! You can't go in there!" shouted a security guard who had noticed the movement, but Marcus was already at the top of the 2-meter-high gate. He jumped into the forbidden lawn, his feet touching for the first time that soft grass he had imagined so many times. But there was no time to marvel. The woman in the water was drowning, and that was all that mattered. Marcus ran like he had never run in his life. His bare feet flew over the perfect lawn, then over the paved paths, heading towards the lake with a determination that surprised even himself. Well-dressed people screamed and pointed, but their words were lost in the wind. All Marcus could hear were the increasingly faint cries of the woman in the water. "Robert! Don't let me die!" When he reached the edge of the lake, Marcus did not hesitate for a second. While other adults stood paralyzed, debating what to do, he simply took off his tattered t-shirt and dove into the cold water. The impact was brutal. The water's temperature cut into his skin like thousands of ice needles, making him involuntarily gasp. But Marcus had grown up swimming in the Harlem River when the hydroelectric plants opened the floodgates in the summer. Cold water was not new to him. His thin but strong arms sliced through the surface with precise and economical movements. Each stroke brought him closer to the woman who was desperately struggling to stay afloat. Marcus could see her pale face, her wide blue eyes filled with terror, her blonde hair clinging to her face like dark seaweed. "Hang in there, ma'am!" he shouted, his voice still firm despite the effort. "I'm coming!" The natural elegance of his movements in the water contrasted dramatically with his humble appearance. As he swam, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, not just for saving a life, but for doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences he might face for having invaded that forbidden place. The heavy fabric of the woman's dress had spread in the water like a dark stain, and Marcus could see how she struggled against the weight pulling her down. Her jewelry sparkled under the water like tiny deadly stars. "Don't give up!" Marcus shouted again, his legs working furiously to keep him afloat as he approached. People began to gather on the shore of the lake, many of them exclaiming in surprise at seeing a poor, barefoot child trying to save one of the richest women in the park. Some shouted instructions, others called for someone to get professional help, but Marcus blocked out all external sounds. His only concern was reaching that woman before it was too late. With one last powerful stroke, Marcus finally reached Margaret, his small arms stretching out towards her in the murky, cold water of the ornamental lake. When Marcus finally reached Margaret in the cold water, their eyes met for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. She was in total panic, her uncoordinated movements creating waves that threatened to drown them both. The silk dress had turned into a deadly trap, wrapping around her legs like dark tentacles, while the weight of the jewelry pulled her relentlessly to the bottom. "Ma'am, listen to me," Marcus said with a surprisingly calm voice, considering he was just a 12-year-old child facing a life-or-death situation. "You need to stop thrashing, okay? I'm here to help you." In her desperation, Margaret instinctively clung to the boy's thin shoulders, her well-manicured nails digging into his skin. The sudden weight pushed Marcus down, and he swallowed a mouthful of lake water, but he didn't lose his composure. "No, not like that," he said patiently, even struggling to keep them both afloat. "Look at me, ma'am. Look into my eyes." There was something in that boy's voice, a serenity that transcended his age that made Margaret focus on him. Her blue eyes, clouded by panic, met Marcus's honey-colored eyes, and for a moment she managed to breathe. "That's it, very good," Marcus encouraged, his small arms working furiously to keep them floating. "Now you're going to turn around and hold on to my shoulders very lightly, just to support yourself. I'm going to swim for both of us, but you need to stay calm." Margaret weakly nodded, trying to follow the boy's instructions. But the dress continued to drag her down, and the weight of the pearl necklace was literally suffocating her. Marcus immediately noticed the problem. "That necklace is too heavy," he said, his small hands trying to reach the clasp. "Can I take it off?" Yes, take it all off," Margaret gasped, desperate. With agile movements that demonstrated impressive presence of mind, Marcus managed to open the clasp of the pearl necklace. The expensive object disappeared into the dark water like a silver snake, freeing Margaret's neck. Then he helped her take off the heavy diamond earrings, which also vanished into the depths of the lake. "Now it will be easier," Marcus said, repositioning himself to start swimming toward the shore. "Relax your body, ma'am. Imagine you are a leaf floating on the water." The boy began to swim on his back, pulling Margaret with him. It was a Herculean task for someone so small. She weighed almost double his weight, and the silk dress seemed to have quadrupled in weight. But Marcus had grown up swimming in much more dangerous waters than this, and his determination was unwavering. With each stroke, he murmured words of encouragement. "You're doing well, ma'am. We're almost there. Just a little more." His thin legs kicked with rhythmic strength, while his arms, despite the growing pain, never stopped moving. The cold water was starting to affect even Marcus, but he showed no signs of giving up. "Margaret! Marcus!" Robert finally managed to break the trance of panic that had paralyzed him. Seeing the boy heroically struggling to save his wife, he ran along the shore to the nearest point to the pair. "I'm here! I'm here! Sir!" Marcus shouted, his voice still firm despite the effort. "When we get close, you will have to pull her out. I'm going to give her a push from underneath." Robert knelt on the rocky shore, his hands trembling with adrenaline and fear. "I'm ready! Bring her here!" Marcus made a final effort, his energy reserves almost depleted. With movements that seemed impossible for someone so small, he managed to maneuver Margaret to the shore. When they were within reach, he dove under her, positioning his shoulders beneath her hips. "Now, sir!" he shouted, emerging and pushing Margaret up with all the strength he had left. Robert grabbed his wife's arms, pulling her out of the water with a strength he didn't even know he possessed. Margaret emerged like a wounded mermaid, coughing violently, expelling water from her lungs as she desperately clung to the grass. "Margaret! My God, Margaret!" Robert hugged her so tightly that he almost hurt her, tears of relief streaming down his face. "You're alive! You're alive!" But Marcus was still in the water, too exhausted to get out on his own. Robert, realizing this, reached out and pulled the boy to the shore with the same urgency he had used to save his wife. Marcus collapsed on the grass, his small shoulders rising and falling rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. His tattered clothes dripped, and his lips were slightly blue from the cold, but in his eyes shone a deep satisfaction. Margaret, still trembling and coughing, turned to look at the boy who had saved her life. Her blue eyes, now clear of panic, met his, and she saw there a purity and courage that left her speechless. You saved my life," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the water she had swallowed. Marcus simply smiled, that genuine smile that lit up his thin face. "It's all right now, ma'am. It's all right." The silence that followed the rescue was broken only by the sound of Margaret's still labored breathing and the constant dripping of water that ran from her soaked clothes. Robert knelt beside his wife, one hand caressing her pale face, the other trembling uncontrollably from the adrenaline rush. "My God!" he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "My God, Margaret, I thought I had lost you." Margaret tried to speak, but could only cough up more water, her body shaking violently. Robert took off his expensive wool coat and carefully wrapped it around her, then turned to Marcus, who was still lying on the lawn, recovering from the Herculean effort. "Boy," Robert said, his voice filled with a reverence he rarely showed. You saved my wife's life." Marcus slowly sat up, running a hand through his wet hair that clung to his forehead. His honey-colored eyes met Robert's, and he simply nodded modestly, as if saving lives was something he did every day. "She was drowning," Marcus said simply, his voice still a bit hoarse. "I just did what anyone would do." Robert shook his head vehemently, his hands already desperately searching for his wallet in the inner pocket of his wet suit. No, you don't understand. You are a hero. A true hero." The Italian leather wallet emerged from his pocket, and Robert opened it with trembling fingers. His hands passed over the platinum credit cards, the important documents, until he found the compartment where he kept cash. He took out all the money he had, several $100 bills, some 50s, a considerable stack that represented more money than Marcus had ever seen together. "Here." Robert extended the money towards the boy, his eyes shining with sincere gratitude. "Take this. It's not even close to what you deserve, but it's all I have with me right now." Marcus looked at the money, and for a moment, Robert could see the internal struggle playing out on the boy's face. That amount could solve many problems: buy medicine for his sick mother, pay overdue bills, maybe even get new shoes for his hurt feet. But then, to Robert's complete shock, Marcus gently shook his head and pushed the man's hand away. "No, thank you, sir," Marcus said with a politeness that contrasted with his ragged clothes. "I don't want your money." Robert was completely perplexed. But you must want something. You saved her life. You deserve a reward." Marcus slowly stood up, his muscles still sore from the effort. He looked at Margaret, who was starting to regain color in her face, then at Robert, and finally at the lake where he had almost lost his life saving a stranger. "I didn't jump in the water for money," Marcus said, his voice laden with a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. "I did it because she needed help." "But you're just a kid," Robert insisted, still holding the money. "You must have family needs. Let me help." It was then that something changed in Marcus's face. A shadow passed over his honey-colored eyes, a deep sadness that seemed to come from the depths of his small soul. His hands, still slightly trembling from the cold, clenched into fists at his sides. "I have family, yes," Marcus said, his voice starting to tremble. "I had." Robert furrowed his brow, realizing he had touched on something painful. Margaret, despite her weakened condition, also noticed the change in the boy's tone and struggled to sit up, leaning on her husband's arm. Marcus looked at the couple, and tears began to form in his eyes. They were not the tears of an ordinary child, they were tears that carried the weight of adult pain, of a loss that no child should experience. "I just wanted," he began, his voice breaking. "I just wanted someone to have done that for my mom." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs, and Margaret, even in her fragile state, felt her heart constrict. She also screamed for help. Marcus continued, the tears now flowing freely down his thin face. She also needed someone to save her, but no one stopped. No one cared. Robert stood petrified, the money forgotten in his hand. The boy's words echoed in his mind like a funeral bell, carrying a moral weight he was not prepared to bear. "I just wish someone had jumped in the water for her too," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "But no one jumped. And now she's gone." The world seemed to stop around them. Robert opened and closed his mouth several times, trying to find words, but nothing came. Margaret covered her mouth with her hands, tears mixing with the droplets of lake water still clinging to her eyelashes. Marcus wiped his eyes with the wet sleeve of his ragged t-shirt, trying to regain his composure. "That's why I can't accept your money, sir. Because what I did today was what I hoped someone would have done for her." Robert remained in absolute silence, the money still extended in his trembling hand, completely stunned by the weight of the words he had just heard. Marcus stood before the couple, his small hands trembling not only from the cold but from the pain that was beginning to overflow from his chest. The silence stretched between them like an abyss, and Robert could see that the boy was struggling with something far greater than his strength should bear. "My mother's name was Sarah," Marcus began, his voice weak like a whisper in the wind. "Sarah Collins. She died 5 days ago, right there." He pointed with his trembling finger to a spot on the lawn, just a few meters from where they stood. Robert followed the boy's gaze and felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized he was looking at a place that seemed perfectly normal, but had been the scene of a tragedy he hadn't even known existed. "She had gotten sick," Marcus continued, tears starting to roll down his face again. "She had been coughing up blood for weeks, but we didn't have money to go to the doctor. She said it was just a cold, but I knew it was worse." Margaret, still wrapped in her husband's coat, felt her heart break at the raw pain in that boy's eyes. She tried to step closer, but her legs were still too weak. "That morning," Marcus went on, his voice becoming higher as emotion took over him, "she said she was feeling better. We had slept on the bench over there, and she wanted to walk a bit. She said the fresh air would do her good." The boy paused, swallowing hard, as if the next words were glass in his throat. Robert remained still holding the money, but now completely forgotten in its existence. "She collapsed right here." Marcus pointed again to the lawn. "She started coughing, and a lot of blood came out. A lot of blood. She fell to her knees and was trying to breathe, but she couldn't." The tears were now falling freely, and Marcus made no effort to hide them anymore. "I ran to her, held her hand, and she looked at me with so much fear. I had never seen my mother so scared." Robert felt his own throat close up, and he realized his hands were trembling as much as the boy's. "She started screaming," Marcus continued, his voice breaking completely. "She was screaming, 'Help me, please, help me.' I screamed too, asking everyone who passed by. There were so many people, sir. So many beautiful people, well-dressed, just like you." The boy looked directly at Robert, and there was a silent accusation in his eyes that pierced a man's heart more deeply than any blade could. "But they just looked and walked right by," Marcus said, his voice heavy with a bitterness no child should know. "Some held their bags tighter, others crossed the street. One lady even told her husband, 'Let's go another way, dear, there are some beggars over there.'" Margaret sobbed loudly, covering her face with her hands. The image of that desperate boy trying to save his dying mother while the world ignored them was too devastating to bear. "I held her hand and told her it would be okay," Marcus continued, now crying openly. But she was getting weaker and weaker. She tried to tell me something, but only blood came out of her mouth. The boy knelt down, touching the grass with reverence, as if it were a sacred altar. She died here, sir. Died holding my hand, and I couldn't do anything. Nothing. Robert felt his own tears begin to roll down his face. The guilt that was starting to grow in his chest was suffocating. How many times had he himself passed by needy people without a second glance? When she stopped breathing, Marcus said, his voice now a broken whisper, I stayed here with her until the police arrived. Someone finally called, but it was too late. Too late. The boy slowly stood up, wiping his face with the wet sleeve of his shirt. Before she died, I promised her I would never let this happen to anyone else. I promised I would always help, even when no one helped me. Robert was completely devastated. The boy's words echoed in his mind like a moral judgment he was not prepared to face. He looked at the money in his hand and suddenly felt nauseated by the futility of the gesture. That's why I can't accept your money, Marcus said, his voice gaining a strange strength despite the tears. Because what I did today wasn't a favor. It was a promise. It was what I promised my mother. The boy took a step back, preparing to leave. She taught me that everyone deserves to be saved, sir. Everyone. Even when we have nothing, even when we are invisible to others. Marcus looked one last time at the spot where his mother had died, then at the couple who had saved him. I just wish someone had thought that way when she needed it. He began to walk away, his worn shoes making small sounds on the wet grass. Robert and Margaret remained paralyzed, watching that little hero prepare to leave their lives as abruptly as he had entered, leaving them forever changed by his devastating story. Robert remained frozen, watching the small, thin figure of Marcus slowly walk away across the lawn. Each step the boy took seemed to echo in his chest like a hammer striking his conscience. The money in his hand, which moments before had seemed like a noble gesture, now felt like a grotesque insult. Marcus's words reverberated in his mind like funeral bells. She also screamed for help, but no one stopped. Robert closed his eyes, trying to block out the images that began to form in his imagination, a sick, desperate woman dying on the ground while well-dressed people passed by her as if she were an inconvenient obstacle. People like him. Robert's chest began to constrict with a pain he had never experienced before. It wasn't physical, it was something much deeper, something that cut through decades of carefully constructed privilege and indifference. For the first time in his 52 years of life, Robert Sterling was feeling the overwhelming weight of true empathy. My God, he murmured, his voice barely a strangled whisper. My God, what have we done? Margaret, still weak but sensing her husband's torment, reached out to touch him. Robert. But he was lost in his own thoughts, in an avalanche of memories that suddenly took on a completely different meaning. How many times had he walked the streets of Manhattan, carefully avoiding the gaze of needy people? How many times had he crossed the street upon seeing someone asking for help? How many mothers like Sarah had he ignored? Robert watched Marcus walk away, and what he saw broke something fundamental inside him. There was no bitterness in the boy's small shoulders, no resentment in his steps. Despite having lost everything, literally everything, he had still chosen to save the life of a stranger. He had still chosen to be kind in a world that had never been kind to him. He saved you, Robert whispered to Margaret, his words laden with both admiration and horror. He saved you, and I didn't even know he existed 5 minutes ago. The realization hit Robert like a speeding train. While he lived in his mansion in Palm Beach, worrying about corporate mergers and dividends, that extraordinary boy had been suffering just a few miles away. While Robert complained about minor inconveniences, Marcus had held his dying mother's hand in a public park, ignored by all the people who could have made a difference. We could have helped, Robert murmured, his voice breaking. If I had known, if I had just paid attention. But he knew that was a comforting lie. He had paid attention, he had chosen not to see. He had walked past poverty, pain, despair, and had actively chosen to look the other way. Robert looked at his hands that had never known manual labor, had never held someone who was dying, had never offered genuine help to a stranger. He mentally compared them to Marcus's small, calloused hands, hands that had held his mother until her last breath, hands that had risked everything to save Margaret. "He's just a child," Robert whispered, tears beginning to roll down his face. "A child who lost everything, and yet he saved the most precious thing I have." The contrast was devastating. Robert had everything: money, power, influence, a comfortable life surrounded by all imaginable luxuries. Marcus had lost everything: his mother, his home, his security, his childhood. And yet, when the moment came to test the true character of both, it had been Marcus who had demonstrated true greatness. Robert felt something break inside his chest, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if a wall he had built over decades was cracking, letting in a painful but necessary light. For the first time in his life, he was seeing the world through the eyes of someone who had nothing, yet had still chosen to give everything. "He has nowhere to sleep tonight," Robert suddenly realized, and the thought hit him like a punch to the stomach. "He has no one. No one." Margaret, watching the transformation on her husband's face, felt her own heart break. She had been saved by an angel, a small, thin angel, dressed in rags, who had lost everything but had still chosen to save strangers. Robert looked at Marcus, who was now almost at the edge of the park, and felt a desperate urgency take hold of him. He couldn't let that boy simply disappear. He couldn't allow the person who had saved his reason for living to get lost in the darkness of an indifferent world. "Wait!" Robert suddenly shouted, his voice echoing across the park. "Marcus! Please wait!" The boy stopped, turned slowly, and Robert saw a cautious look of surprise in his eyes. The millionaire stumbled to his feet, still holding the forgotten money, and began to run toward the boy who had changed his life forever. 3 days after the meeting in the park, Robert Sterling was sitting in his office on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Miami, surrounded by piles of documents, photographs, and reports he had requested through his contacts in the police, the hospital, and private security companies. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the files, and his eyes were red from crying and lack of sleep. "Mr. Sterling," said Jennifer Walsh, a private investigator he had hired, entering the office with another folder. "I got the records from the General Hospital. Sarah Collins had worked there for almost 15 years as a nurse." Robert took the folder with trembling hands, opening it to reveal a photo of a smiling woman in a white uniform. Sarah had kind eyes and a warm smile, nothing that indicated the terrible fate that awaited her. Next to the photo was her employment record. "Exemplary nurse, beloved by patients, never missed a day of work." "How did she end up on the streets?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Jennifer sighed deeply. "She was laid off 2 years ago when the hospital cut staff. At 43, with a young child to support, she couldn't find another job. The record shows she lost her apartment 6 months later and no one helped her," Robert finished, closing his eyes. "A nurse who dedicated her life to caring for others, and when she needed help, no one cared." The investigator placed another file on the table. "Mr. Sterling, it might be better not to see this." But Robert had already opened it. They were photographs from the park's security cameras, showing the last moments of Sarah Collins. He watched in horror as the woman staggered across the lawn, clearly ill, with Marcus running after her. He saw the moment she collapsed, saw the boy kneeling beside her, saw them both screaming for help. And he saw people passing by. "Pause there," Robert murmured, pointing at the screen. "Zoom in on that person." Jennifer complied, and Robert felt his stomach churn. On the screen, clearly visible, was Charles Whitmore, a member of Robert's country club board, walking with his wife. They looked directly at Sarah and Marcus, spoke to each other, and deliberately crossed to the other side of the park. "Continue," Robert said, his voice a strangled whisper. The footage continued, showing person after person ignoring the tragedy unfolding. Robert recognized more faces: Victoria Ashford, wife of a federal judge; Dr. Hamilton Pierce, cardiologist at Miami's most exclusive hospital; Sandra McCarthy, president of the local charity association. "My God!" Robert murmured, covering his face with his hands. I know these people. They come to my house, drink my champagne, talk about charity at fancy dinners. Jennifer rewound the footage a few minutes. Mr. Sterling, there's something else. Look at this man here. Robert looked at the screen and saw a middle-aged man, well-dressed, who had stopped for a moment upon seeing Sarah on the ground. For a second, Robert thought someone was finally going to help. But then he saw the man check his expensive watch, say something on the phone, and walk away quickly. Who is he? Robert asked, though something in his stomach already knew the answer. The timestamp shows it was exactly at the time of the meeting you had with the Sterling Industries board that morning. This man, he said he was late for an important meeting. Robert felt the world spin around him. He had been less than 200 meters away when Sarah died. His meeting, his company, his corporate decisions had been more important than the life of a desperate woman. How many people passed by her? Robert asked, his voice barely audible. We counted 63 people in the 20 minutes it took her to die, Jennifer replied. 63 people who saw her, who saw the boy asking for help, and who chose not to act. Robert staggered to his feet, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Down below, he could see people walking on the sidewalks, each wrapped up in their own lives, in their own problems. How many tragedies were happening at this very moment that he was ignoring? There's more, Jennifer continued. Sarah had taken Marcus to the emergency room 3 times in the weeks leading up to her death. In the records, she begged the doctors to admit her, saying she was too sick to care for her son. But since she had no health insurance, they sent her away, Robert finished, feeling nauseous. All 3 times. They gave her basic antibiotics and told her to rest. As if a homeless woman could rest. Robert picked up another file, Marcus's school records. The boy had been an exemplary student until 2 years ago, when he started missing classes. The grades, which had previously all been A's, began to drop drastically. There were notes from teachers. Marcus seems malnourished, dirty clothes for several days, fell asleep during class. No one investigated, Robert murmured, reading the observations. No one asked why a brilliant boy was suddenly failing. Jennifer shook her head. The system wasn't designed to care for people like Sarah and Marcus, Mr. Sterling. It was designed to keep them invisible. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the crushing weight of the truth. He had spent decades living in a bubble of privilege, surrounded by people who, like him, had chosen not to see the suffering around them. He had built his empire on a foundation of indifference, and now understood that every dollar he owned had been earned while people like Sarah and Marcus suffered in silence. Mr. Sterling, Jennifer said softly, what do you intend to do with this information? Robert was silent for a long moment, looking at the city below. Then, slowly, he turned to the investigator, and she saw in his eyes a determination that hadn't been there before. I'm going to change everything, he said, his voice firm despite the tears. I'm going to change everything. The homeless shelter in Miami was located in a part of the city that Robert had never visited before in his 52 years of life. The smell of disinfectant mixed with sweat and despair hit his nostrils the moment he walked through the double metal doors. His hands trembled slightly as he held the folder with all the investigation documents, and his heart beat so loudly that he could hear it echoing in his ears. I'm looking for Marcus Collins, he said to the woman at the reception, a middle-aged lady with tired but kind eyes. He's in the back courtyard, she replied, studying the well-dressed man in front of her. But please be gentle with him. That boy has been through a lot. Robert nodded, unable to speak. He walked through the narrow hallways, passing by overcrowded rooms where entire families lived in spaces smaller than his closet. The sound of crying babies and whispered conversations created a symphony of survival that he had never imagined existed. When he found Marcus, the boy was sitting alone on a concrete bench, looking at a small drawing he had made on a piece of paper. It was a portrait of a smiling woman with brown hair, Sarah. Marcus, Robert said softly, and the boy looked up, surprised. Mr. Sterling? Marcus quickly stood up, hiding the drawing behind his back. How did you find me? Robert sat down on the bench, leaving space between them, respecting the boy's natural distrust. I needed to talk to you. I needed to apologize. Marcus frowned, confused. Apologize? Why? Robert opened the folder with trembling hands and showed Marcus the photographs from the security cameras. I investigated your mother's death. I found out the truth about what happened that day. Marcus looked at the images, and Robert saw his small hands clench into fists. 63 people, Marcus murmured. I counted them all. I know, Robert said, his voice breaking. And I also know that some of those people are part of my social circle. People I call friends. People I respected. Robert showed Marcus another file: the hospital records, Sarah's work history, the timeline of how she had lost everything. Your mother was an exemplary nurse. She dedicated 15 years of her life caring for others. And when she needed help, we all failed her. Marcus picked up the photo of Sarah in her hospital uniform, tracing her face with his finger. She used to say that one day things would get better. That someone would help us. He looked at Robert with tear-filled eyes. But no one ever helped. I know, Robert whispered. And I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for living my whole life ignoring people like you. I'm so sorry for passing by you without seeing. I'm so sorry for being part of a system that let your mother die alone. Robert knelt in front of Marcus, placing his hands on the boy's small shoulders. Marcus, I can't bring your mother back. I can't undo what happened. But I want to try to do something right. Marcus looked at him cautiously. What do you mean? I want you to come live with me and Margaret. I want to adopt you legally. I want you to be my son. Marcus took a step back, shaking his head. I don't want your pity, Mr. Sterling. I don't want you to feel better by giving me money. It's not pity, Robert said quickly. It's love. It's justice. It's what should have happened from the beginning. He took a deep breath. Marcus, you saved my wife's life. You showed a kindness that I never learned in 52 years of life. You taught me what it means to be truly human. Robert took another set of documents from the folder. I also want to create a foundation in memory of your mother. The Sarah Collins Foundation. It will help homeless families, especially single mothers with children. It will provide housing, medical care, education. It will ensure that no child goes through what you went through. Marcus looked at the documents, then at Robert. Why would you do that? Because your mother deserves to be remembered. Because her story deserves to be told. Because there are thousands of other Sarahs and other Marcuses out there, and they deserve better than what they received. Robert stood up, extending his hand to Marcus. I can't promise that I'll be the perfect father. I'm still learning how to be a decent human being. But I promise that I will try every day. I promise that I will honor your mother's memory with my actions. Marcus was silent for a long moment, studying Robert's face. Finally, he said, My mother always said that people can change. That love can transform even the hardest hearts. She was right, Robert murmured. You and she transformed mine. Marcus looked at the drawing of Sarah in his hands, then at Robert. She would want me to have a family. She always wanted me to go to school, to have a normal life. Then let me give that to you, Robert said. Not as charity, but as family. As father and son. Marcus was silent for another moment, then slowly reached out his hand to Robert. Okay, he said softly. But I want to help with the foundation. I want to make sure that other kids don't go through what I went through. Robert took Marcus's small hand, feeling tears rolling down his face. Of course. We will work together. Father and son. Marcus nodded slowly, and for the first time since his mother's death, Robert saw a small smile cross his face. Father and son, he repeated, and the words sounded like a promise of hope in a world that had forgotten how to care for one another. 6 months later, the same park where Sarah Collins had died was transformed. Hundreds of people gathered in a semicircle around a beautiful bronze sculpture, a woman kneeling with outstretched arms, protecting a child. The plaque at the base shone under the Miami sun, Memorial Sarah Collins Nurse, Mother, Hero. Love never abandons. Robert Sterling was on the small stage set up for the occasion, wearing a simple suit and holding the microphone with hands that no longer trembled. Beside him, Margaret smiled radiantly, fully recovered, her gray hair shining in the sun. But all eyes were on the 12-year-old boy approaching the microphone, Marcus Collins Sterling, now legally adopted, wearing a navy blue blazer, but still with the same deep, wise eyes that had touched Robert's heart months before. My mom used to say that people only see what they want to see, Marcus began, his clear and firm voice echoing through the speakers. She said that for most people, we were invisible. But she also said that could change, that love had the power to open people's eyes. Robert felt a lump in his throat as he listened to the boy's words. In the audience, he could see faces he recognized, some of the same ones he had seen in the security footage, people who had ignored Sarah that terrible day. Some were openly crying, others kept their eyes down, ashamed. My mom, Sarah Collins, worked for 15 years caring for others, Marcus continued. When she got sick and lost everything, the world abandoned her. But even in her last moments, she was trying to protect someone. She saved the life of Margaret Sterling, and in doing so, she taught us that love is stronger than indifference. Margaret wiped the tears rolling down her face, remembering the woman who had thrown herself in front of the horse to save her. She had insisted that part of the foundation be dedicated specifically to free medical care for homeless people, in honor of the woman who had given her life for her. The Sarah Collins Foundation is not just about helping people, Marcus said, looking directly at the audience. It's about remembering that every person has value. That every life matters. That we can no longer pretend we don't see the suffering around us. Robert stepped closer to the microphone, placing a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. In the last 6 months, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, this foundation has already helped 200 families find permanent housing. We have provided free medical care to over 1,000 people. And we have saved 15 lives, 15 people who were on the brink of death due to lack of basic care. He paused, looking at the crowd. But the most important number is one. One life that changed mine forever. Marcus taught me that true wealth is not in bank accounts or properties. It is in our ability to care for one another. In the audience, Robert saw Dr. Hamilton Pierce, the cardiologist who had ignored Sarah that day. Now he was donating 2 mornings a week to treat homeless patients for free. Victoria Ashford, the judge's wife, had become a volunteer in the foundation's community kitchen. Even Charles Whitmore, who had deliberately crossed to the other side of the park, was present, having donated $1 million to the cause. Sarah Collins died because we all failed, Robert continued. She died because we chose not to see. But her death was not in vain if we use her memory to ensure that this never happens again. After the ceremony, when the crowd dispersed and the last visitors left, Robert and Marcus walked together to Mount Olive Cemetery, a few blocks from the park. Sarah's gravestone was simple yet elegant, made of white marble with an inscription that Marcus had chosen. Sarah Collins, she never stopped caring. Marcus knelt before the gravestone, placing a bouquet of white lilies, his mother's favorite flowers. "Hi, Mom," he whispered. "I have a family now. Robert and Margaret are good to me. They love me, and I love them too." Robert knelt beside Marcus, placing his own red rose next to the lilies. "Sarah," he said softly, "I promise I will honor your memory every day of my life. I promise I will care for Marcus as if he were my own blood. And I promise I will never again close my eyes to the suffering around me." Marcus stood up and hugged Robert, and the two remained silent for a moment, honoring the woman who had changed their lives forever. As they walked back to the car, Robert looked at the boy who was now his son and felt a peace he had never experienced before. "You know," he said, "your mother accomplished something I never thought possible." "What was it?" Marcus asked, taking Robert's hand. Robert stopped and looked at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "She lost everything, and yet saved what was most precious to me. She gave me a family. She gave me you. She gave me a reason to live that goes beyond myself." Robert squeezed Marcus's hand, feeling the responsibility and love that now defined his life. "Now it's my turn to do what is right. It's our turn to do what is right." Marcus smiled, And together they walked home, where Margaret was waiting for them with a warm dinner and stories to tell about the new beneficiaries of the foundation they had visited that day. The house that once echoed with loneliness now vibrated with laughter, conversation, and the kind of love that can only be born from tragedy transformed into purpose.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.